Several hundred years ago, something so incredible developed that some people have called it a miracle. Some have even gone so far as to call it the miracle. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to avoid such hagiographic profanity and simply call it liberalism. Today we're going to focus on small L classical liberalism, which has played a large role in shaping what we like to call modernity. We're talking individual rights, free trade, freedom of speech and religion, and other liberal values. For most of us, liberalism is baked into the cake of how we see the world. The achievements of liberalism are hard to argue with, and yet, liberalism has a massive weakness that we have yet to reckon with. A weakness very clearly illuminated by the research of the dentist Weston A Price. In the early 20th century, Price traveled the world, trying to find out why many more isolated communities experienced better health outcomes and significantly less tooth decay, while those living on the modern program of industrialized food were suffering so many deleterious health outcomes. Now, to be clear, Price's intent was not to explore the idea of liberalism. Price's approach was motivated by the goal of finding out what healthy humans look like without a doctor in order to better understand what a human should look like after the doctor was done with them. Price and others were concerned that the allopathic, or heroic, model of medical science preferred to work backward from the grave rather than forward from the cradle. Unfortunately, nearly 100 years later, we still haven't figured out how to approach illness in a holistic manner, with most doctors and health experts focused on downstream diseases and treating humans as compartmentalized body parts. So we're going to come back to Price in just a minute, because his investigations, bolstered with some fascinating observations from George Orwell, yes, that George Orwell, are, in my opinion, some of the best examples of the shortcomings of liberalism. But first, let's explore liberalism just a bit more. Although liberalism was not the only reason cheap refined foods were exported abroad and nutrient-dense local food cultures were undermined, tenets of liberalism played a role in justifying, informing, and accelerating the growth and exportation of these foods. Prior to the advent of modern capitalist theories, European powers were heavily influenced by what we have come to call mercantilist ideas. Mercantilism was typified by the belief that there was a fixed amount of wealth in the world, and so it was up to each power and their affiliated trading companies to gather their share of that booty. This made European powers especially fearful of importing more than they were exporting. Importing too much and sending precious metals out of the homeland was seen as bleeding a state's resources. Mercantilist theory encouraged the idea that if a good could be produced at home, even if it was more expensive, a state should support and protect that industry. Mercantilism also encouraged European powers to see everything as a zero-sum game. For example, the increase of Dutch economic power theoretically meant the British were losing out. The motivation for extraction, both from ecological and human standpoints, was intense. European powers sought to squeeze as much as they could from their overseas colonies, accelerating deforestation, environmental degradation, and human misery at a massive scale through conquest and the coerced and slave labor that accompanied it. Enlightenment thinkers took special aim at mercantilist ideas. John Locke argued that the wealth of nations was not set so rigidly, and the division and specialization of labor, backed by capital, could massively increase the production and wealth of a country. Adam Smith lambasted most uses of tariffs, which he argued usually worked against a nation's wealth, and argued that a nation did not need a large reserve of precious metals in order to have a vibrant economy. But even more so, as the historian Christopher Lasch explains, the genius of Adam Smith and his predecessors was to put forward a vision of the world that found a positive characterization of self-gratification in driving production and the hope of indefinite expansion. While previous generations had worried that insatiable appetites would lead to corruption and decay, Smith believed there was a way to leverage the vain and empty distinctions of greatness to keep the gears of civilization and the economy churning. As people sought their own, they served as social benefactors, and civilization could avoid the seemingly inevitable decay and death contained in the biological life cycle perspectives of other theorists. Lasch ultimately believed that Smith's paradigm of progress, while an incredible engine for economic growth and innovation, would ultimately outstrip its resources, both ecological and social. This is something we'll return to later with Weston A Price, so keep it in mind. And so, European powers eventually began to shift away from the protectionist ideas of mercantilism and embrace the practice of free trade. Well, kinda, because there was still protectionism, imperial colonization, and free trade wasn't and isn't always necessarily free, hence the rich historical debate about free trade imperialism, which I will probably make a video about in the future, so make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss it. Despite these caveats, the overall liberal commitment to free trade encouraged states not to worry too much if a good could be produced more cheaply in another nation. All the better, they would say. No need to enact protectionist policies to safeguard that industry at home. Just find things you can do better and export those products or services. Then you'll have cheaper goods all around. No longer was it a zero-sum game, it was now win-win. And according to a certain range of metrics, the liberal thinkers were right. Free markets, specialization, and the division of labor and free trade revolutionized the wealth of nations, increasing the affordability of goods that used to be only accessible to the rich, democratizing consumption and serving as an engine for innovation and economic growth. To illustrate the power of this miraculous economic system, you need only look in your spice cabinet, say some liberal boosters, which is full of goods that the mercantilist empires went to war for. Or perhaps they assure you, when you start to feel a bit uneasy about this way of life, you can make a trip to Walmart, which houses riches that far outstrip the wealth of the kings of the past and which are now at the fingertips of everyone with a bit of disposable income or easy credit. They have a strong case when making this argument. Take, for example, Leonard Read's 1958 short story, I Pencil My Family Tree, the story beloved by the economist Milton Friedman that features a pencil telling its origin story. As the pencil explains, no single person in the world knows how to make a pencil. A pencil is the result of specialized knowledge and labor responding to price signals in harmonious global cooperation. Cedarwood from Oregon, graphite from Ceylon, clay from Mississippi, candelillo from Mexico, zinc and copper from who knows where, rapeseed oil from the Dutch East Indies, pumice from Italy, not to mention all the tools and special skills to get these materials to the desired location to produce the pencil. It is undeniable that the capitalist revolution is indeed extraordinary, and it, along with the scientific revolution and technological innovation it fueled over the past several centuries, led to incredible increases in the global transfer of cheaper goods, including, as Weston A Price observed, cheaper refined foods that flooded the global marketplace. For the liberal economist, these cheaper and more shelf-stable calories were a good thing. People in areas of the world suited to produce large swaths of cash crops could maximize their land's productive capacity and sell the cash crops in the global marketplace. Those situated in prime locations for capturing and canning natural resources like salmon could focus on exporting those resources. The increased revenue would then allow them to turn around and buy goods like textiles from places where they could be made more cheaply. This increased efficiency, innovation, growing markets, and capital flow meant that the rising tide would lift all ships. Many hoped the increased efficiency would free mankind from the drudgery of manual labor and allow humans to enjoy the blessings of leisure, like playing tennis on the wings of a biplane or having flagpole sitting competitions. No longer did you need to do the hard work of catching and preserving your food for the winter or slaughtering a cow or a pig with your neighbors. Thanks to the genius liberal system, you could now just open a can. But the increased flow and affordability of cheap refined foods enacted, and still enacts, great costs that escape the view of liberal theorists, and the observations of Weston A Price and George Orwell really highlight these overlooked costs at the base of the liberal world order. So let's first examine two regions Price visited, which show how liberal capitalist expansion undermined intact food cultures with devastating consequences. One of the places Price visited was Switzerland, where he sought out isolated communities high in the mountains that subsisted primarily on locally grown food. One striking visit was to the Lochantal Valley, which, because of its difficult-to-access location, produced the majority of its own food. The valley's long winters were followed by summers with an explosion of verdant growth. During the summer, villagers would cut and store high-quality hay in the lowlands, while the cows grazed the even higher quality forage higher up, following the melting snow up the slopes. The women and girls collected this rich milk and made cheese, which they would store for the winter. The diet of these isolated Swiss villagers was undeniably simple. Staple foods consisted of rye bread, butter, and cheese. This standard fare was not very exciting when compared to other Swiss communities incorporated into the modern transportation networks of trains and roads, which allowed them access to the blessings of liberalism: tasty jams, industrial flour, canned goods, and chocolate. But the dental health and overall physical robustness of the isolated communities was far superior to their lowland contemporaries or other highland communities connected to civilization by road or train. Price was impressed with the Locke children who ran barefoot through the glacial meltwater at dusk, while he and his wife were quite happy to stay bundled up in coats and gloves. In the children Price examined, he found an average of only 0.3 cavities per child and well-formed dental arches. Price argued that the Locke food traditions were inextricably linked to the robust health he was observing in the community. In fact, we are still learning reasons why this is the case. Price received samples of food during his journeys and also had food sent to his laboratory, finding fat-soluble vitamins A and D to be especially important for healthy teeth and jaw formation. Price also argued there was an activator X, whose chemical structure he couldn't uncover, but which played a critical role in helping produce the strong teeth, jaws, and overall health he was observing. There is strong evidence now that this activator X is vitamin K2, which is produced by animals when they eat the vitamin K1 in grass and other green plants and convert it to vitamin K2. Pastured eggs and organ meats and grass-fed butter are all excellent sources of vitamin K2, and one can only imagine how nourishing the Locke butter and cheese was, given the incomparable quality of the glacier melt forage their cows ate. We still have much to learn about vitamin K2, but our current understanding is that it acts as a director in the body, helping things go where they're supposed to and avoid places they shouldn't be. Vitamin K2 activates osteocalcin, which helps bones incorporate calcium. It also activates matrix GLA protein, which extracts calcium from arteries and other soft tissues, helping prevent soft tissues from hardening. This is a big deal when you consider that heart disease is the #1 cause of death in the United States. Additionally, because vitamin K2 helps keep calcium from ending up in soft tissues, it is likely that a lack of vitamin K2 has also played a role in septal cartilage calcifying and the extraordinary rate of deviated septums and obstructed airways we are seeing today. And obstructed airways are no laughing matter. One of the most important nutrients our body relies on is oxygen, and properly functioning airways allow us to take in and distribute oxygen in the most efficient way possible. We are supposed to breathe through our noses to get that oxygen most effectively. Breathing through our nose slows, warms, and humidifies the air as well as mixes it with nitric oxide, which all allow your lungs to take up more oxygen. You may recall that calling someone a mouth breather used to be an insult. There is truth that something is off about you if you are a mouth breather, and I say this as someone who has spent much of his life as one. As I have breathed through my mouth, I have literally starved myself, my organs, and my very cells of needed oxygen. Compromised airways make mouth breathers like me much more susceptible to other health problems, such as heart disease, cancer, and autoimmune diseases, not to mention decreased cognitive function. And if you know me personally and my limited intellectual faculties, you'll know that I need all the help I can get. And here we've just talked about a few important nutrients and their influence on a few important aspects of biological health. We could go on for hours about the importance of a nutrient-dense food culture, such as the effect these foods have on cardiovascular health, gut health, and the microbiome, or on inflammation, or the importance of each nutrient and how intact food cultures help make sure each of those nutrients is consumed in a more bioavailable fashion, or the role of healthy food in a body's ability to heal and regenerate after all types of toxic insults. But to keep this video going, I just wanted to emphasize that we are still learning what vital building blocks of our health we have lost in the shift from nutrient-dense food cultures to the liberal industrial food model. This shift is not just a matter of a few extra cavities or crooked teeth. It has contributed significantly to all the health problems that we expect the heroic medical professionals to solve. And with these important points made, it's probably a good idea to get back to Price's Swiss travels. In addition to Locke, Price visited the isolated Swiss village Ayer, whose inhabitants subsisted primarily on rye and dairy as well. They also exhibited much better health outcomes than other areas, especially in the dental arena. Only 2.3% of the children's teeth were attacked by tooth decay, though Price worried that the recently built highway and the trucks that came with it would soon be bearing refined flour, juices, syrups, and sweets, along with the attendant health devastation. Vissois, a village an hour's walk away from Ayer, had been connected to roadways several years earlier, and subsequently had much easier access to the industrial food. In Vissois, he found 20.2% of the village's children's teeth he examined had been attacked, significantly more than Ayer's total of 2.3%. Over and over, Price found poor health outcomes for those eating the fancy modern fare, paying especial attention to the children suffering significant tooth decay, diminished dental arches, and greater susceptibility to diseases like tuberculosis. In one Swiss community, Price tried to establish a clinic that would supplement the children's diet, and he and other officials asked for parents' permission for children to have a nutritionally reinforced meal a day. According to Price, an objection was made that there was no use trying to save the teeth of the girls, and it would be better for the girls to have their teeth pulled and replaced with fake teeth before they were married, because either way, they were going to lose them. The parents' response may sound shocking, but it speaks to the upending of the physical health these areas had experienced, and it wasn't just in Switzerland. In England, there are accounts that women were given vouchers to have all their teeth removed as a wedding or 21st birthday present. There was some logic to this approach, as removing all the teeth at once was seen as cheaper and less painful than several decades of extractions that would likely follow. According to one civil servant of the National Health Service, even up to the 1990s, girls in the northeast of England were given the present of having their teeth removed on their 16th or 18th birthdays. This seems like a good time to bring in George Orwell, whose visits to mining towns in industrial England in 1936 brought him into contact with some of the most malnourished inhabitants of England, and who, like some of the communities Price visited, were subsisting on industrial foods. Orwell heard the opinion from multiple people that it was best to get shut of your teeth as early in life as possible. "Teeth is just a misery," Orwell reported one woman telling him. Orwell stayed in a home of 5 people. The oldest was 43 and the youngest was 15. Of the 5, only the 15-year-old had any of his own teeth, and even the boy's teeth were not going to be around very long. We'll return to some of Orwell's observations, but overall, Orwell corroborated the widespread devastation of industrial foods, which he, like Price, but more informally, saw as the driving cause of so many health problems. So to sum up, communities that had access to the wonders of liberalism, especially its democratization of consumption that included tasty, sugary, canned, and industrial food, suffered terrible health outcomes. Those cut off from the blessings of liberalism and who had intact food cultures like those in the remote Lo Chantal Valley enjoyed robust health and significantly less of a need for outside medical intervention. And Price found this reality over and over again in all the places he visited around the world, including the second place we're going to examine, Alaska. Price visited a number of what he called Eskimo communities, and, based on my best guess from the context of his book, most of these were Yupik communities in Alaska, some of whom did not have access to, or some who chose not to partake of, what was called store grub, the industrialized food found at trading posts and ports. The communities with intact food cultures that Price visited relied heavily on salmon, which they skillfully speared from their kayaks, some salmon so large they could barely lift them. During the salmon runs, they caught copious amounts and dried them for the rest of the year. The fish eggs were preserved and were helpful sources of nutrition for children after they had been weaned. Additionally, the Yupiks hunted seals from their kayaks, the seal oil playing an especially important part of the Yupik diet. Pieces of fish were broken off and dipped in seal oil, which Price explained was one of the richest sources of vitamin A he ever encountered. The seal oil was also helpful in preserving blossoms of flowers and sorrel grass. Other Yupik staples included whales, especially their organ meat and special layers of skin, caribou, ground nuts, kelp, and berries. This diet fostered both healthy teeth and overall robust health. Price was clearly impressed with not just the lack of dental caries among these communities, but the size and strength of the Yupik jaws. He was told that an average adult Yupik man could easily carry 100 pounds in each hand and 100 pounds in his teeth over a significant distance. There was a debate as to where the health of the Yupik teeth and resilience against dental caries came from, the exercising of their jaws or from their diet. Price leaned towards diet, but it's likely that both diet and jaw exercise played an important role. And here is where it's important to say that a food culture, and the subsequent dental health and healthy jaw formation, is more than just the nutritional profile of its food components. And by this I mean a food culture is also the way of gathering, preserving, and especially chewing of the food. Price found that the Yupiks who maintained their food culture were protected from the ravages of store grub. Among these people, Price found tooth decay on only 2 teeth out of 2,138 he examined. That's from 72 people, or 0.09% of teeth suffering from tooth decay. Conversely, among those that ate store grub, he found tooth decay on 394 teeth out of 2,254 teeth, that total coming from 82 people. So we're sitting at 13% tooth decay. Price notes that one of the greatest tragedies was that the Yupiks eating store grub lived hundreds of miles away from the nearest dentist, When people adopted industrial food, they also dramatically increased their susceptibility to tooth decay and other health problems. A journey to see the dentist would take months by dog sleds in the winter, while in the summer months an airplane flight would be the only possible way to reach a dentist, something out of reach for these communities. One mining engineer told Price that it had cost $2,000 to have a dentist flown in for dental service. And remember, this is $2,000 back in the early 1900s. So at this point, we can see that while liberalism led to incredible innovation, delectable trade, and the democratization of the consumption of so many goods, it also meant widespread devastation for human health. Liberalism stalled, or at least put off, decay of the civilizational order, but it ramped up tooth decay, crowded teeth, decreased dental arch sizes, and the subsequent compounding health problems for those incorporated into it. Price did not know, we still don't know, and we will never know, at least in this life, all the health problems that have arisen as a result of us abandoning intact food cultures for industrial replacements. The costs have simply been incalculable. Price found this reality everywhere he went, and while I probably need to make another video addressing the historical and contemporary debates concerning the interrelated health issues of tooth decay, malocclusion, decreased dental arch size, poor airway formation, what causes these issues, as well as the whole host of cascading physiological challenges that arise when things go wrong when proper development is disrupted, I am very comfortable painting the following general picture based not just on Price's work, but on anthropologists and other scholars who have studied the long history of orofacial health. First, we have to understand there is not some pristine past where hunter-gatherers were free from physical ailments followed by a clear historical dividing line where decrepit industrial man emerged suffering from the degenerative diseases of civilization. There are always exceptions to the general trends, including a group of hunter-gatherers around 14,000 years ago in the Mediterranean who ate sumptuous sweet acorns that turned into a sticky paste when cooked and very likely rotted their teeth. But despite some of these counterpoints, in general, according to Harvard evolutionary biologist Daniel Lieberman, Stone Age man rarely would have needed a dentist or an orthodontist. That began to change with the agricultural revolution, with more skulls sporting cavities and abscesses. But even then, as Lieberman explains, less than 5% had impacted wisdom teeth, meaning most people had enough room for all their teeth. Jaw sizes did decrease in the medieval period, but according to dental anthropologist Robert Corricini, the decreases were still modest in comparison with the acceleration in the rates of malocclusion, quote, in the last 150 years in technologically advanced communities, after having shown relatively modest changes for 6,000 years, end of quote. The key phrase here is technologically advanced. By that, he is indicating those living in the orbit of industrialized food products and production. There is general agreement that the era of industrial food represents a watershed moment in human dental and orofacial history, and not in a good way. As dental anthropologist Peter Unger explains, the biggest jump in the caries rate came with the Industrial Revolution, which led to the widespread availability of sucrose and highly processed foods. Additionally, he argues that the industrial foods were soft, which meant that people didn't exercise their jaws as much, and the soft food found refuge in the nooks and crannies that the previous tougher food with dietary abrasives would knock off. And so whatever criticisms you might want to level at Price, that he didn't have a large enough sample size, that he used only selective metrics, or was too thesis-driven in his approach, his overall observations, especially about dental orofacial health, are supported by many scholars who have studied humans' historical dental health. What Price's research shows, and which is corroborated by many, is that the miracle of modern dentistry was not needed by the vast majority of communities with intact nutrient-dense food cultures, who had been isolated from quote-unquote liberal civilization. This protection was especially true for those not incorporated into the initial early modern wave of refined goods, especially sugar, and modernity's subsequent tsunami of industrial foods. Modernity was not swooping in and saving the suffering uncivilized masses from soaring rates of tooth decay, from decreasing dental arch size, and crowded teeth. Modernity actually caused or dramatically exacerbated these problems through the democratization of consumption of cheap industrial foods, our version of sweet sticky acorns now available to everyone. Dentistry was actually Act 2 of modernity's play, donning the mantle of savior when it was in reality modern man's paltry effort to stem the tide of modernity's dental devastation and physical degeneration. But even today, and this is a key point, modern dentistry has not lost its luster, and many people see it as representative of all the progress we have made in large part thanks to the liberal revolutions of modernity. Take, for example, conservative libertarian columnist P.J. O'Rourke, who quipped, quote, "In general, life is better than it has ever been. And if you think that, in the past, there was some golden age of pleasure and plenty to which you would, if you were able, transport yourself, let me say one single word, dentistry." And O'Rourke is not alone. A few years ago, Notre Dame hosted a panel discussion on the book Why Liberalism Failed by political scientist Patrick Deneen, which, to oversimplify the argument, argues that liberalism has been so successful that it has eaten itself. Among the panelists was the conservative pundit Jonah Goldberg, who had many disagreements with Deneen's book. Goldberg said, "I, for one, do not want to go back 500 years. I'm sure that Joachim of Fior was a fascinating guy to have some mead with, but I like modern dentistry. For many small L liberal boosters, dentistry is an unmitigated good to be used as a tidy little phrase to stop debate about the inherent weaknesses of liberalism." And even Deneen struggles to critique modern dentistry. In a different conversation, even while Deneen is arguing that liberalism would not have been able to accomplish what it has without pre-liberal social, cultural, and environmental capital, and while that well is running dry because liberalism has extracted too much, Deneen cites good dentistry as one of the fruits of the modern liberal order he can appreciate. Modern dentistry has such a positive halo effect that even Deneen has to throw positive words its way. I imagine this hedging is in part an effort to ward off criticism from those like Jonah Goldberg. So here I'm in this strange position of having a more pessimistic outlook about this aspect of modernity than the guy who wrote the book arguing that liberalism has failed. But truly, as much as I want to be the glass half full guy, it's hard for me to clap my hands for modern dentistry, and by extension, modernity itself, without significant reservations. The first reservation is that modern dentistry has a lot of problems, something that more honest and thoughtful dentists readily admit about their profession. There are perverse incentives to drill and fill perfectly healthy teeth. Treat to insurance is the motto of many unscrupulous dentists, meaning give the patient dental treatment, whether or not it is needed, if the patient's insurance will cover it. There are horrific stories of unnecessary root canals and tooth extractions, with some terrible examples of private equity firms snapping up dental practices and then pressuring dentists to perform unnecessary procedures to make the investments lucrative. And even if you get a good dentist, the scientific literature recognizes that many dental procedures lack scientific justification. It's actually a little ironic that people will cite modern dentistry as one of the blessings of liberalism when you don't actually want a liberal dentist. You'd much prefer a conservative one. But let's say you've got a competent, honest, and conservative dentist. Then I will agree, it's nice to have some pain numbing and antibiotics when a tooth is pulled or worked on. But wouldn't it be better to have communities with intact food cultures so we don't have to have that tooth drilled or pulled in the first place? It's hard to get giddy about modern dentistry when you have an understanding that the massive increase for the need of modern dentistry came from the spread of modernity's blessings. It isn't just the elites like George Washington and Josephine Bonaparte and the poor urban dwellers who get to rot all their teeth now. It's everyone, even in the most remote and far-flung places that used to be protected by their isolation, who get to have their teeth bombarded. My more pessimistic appraisal of this aspect of modernity comes from the undeniable reality that the democratization of consumption and the explosion of innovation driven by liberalism has been accompanied by so many unrecognized costs. Costs that our ingenious liberal system of self-interested consumption is built upon, and we are quite good at ignoring. And here it is especially illustrative to put Price and Orwell's observations in conversation with each other about two industrial products, canned salmon and chocolate. Let's begin with salmon. In 1836, George Orwell spent several months visiting the mining communities in the industrial north of England, getting right in the thick of it, and then detailing the horrific sights, sounds, and the smells, especially the smells. The terrible living conditions horrified Orwell, and so it was a relief as his train pulled out of one mining community, leaving behind the grit and grime, and entering by train, relatively quickly from his perspective, the beautiful countryside. As Orwell explained, even in the filthy heart of civilization, you find fields where the grass is green instead of gray. Perhaps if you looked for them, you might even find streams with live fish in them instead of salmon tins. In the areas around mining operations, the polluted streams choked out fish for local consumption, and so the locals turned to the international market. Empty cans that once held salmon now littered the streams, helping displace the fish that could have lived there. It's hard to overstate the importance of canned salmon for British consumers at this time. As one 1925 U.S. government report explained, the United Kingdom is the most important market for canned salmon in the world, absorbing from 1/3 to 1/2 of the total exports of both the United States and Canada, about 9/10 of Japan's, and practically all the salmon packed in Siberia and not shipped to Japan. So it's not surprising that Orwell would have seen so many salmon tins filling the streams. The canned salmon export industry was also very influenced by competitive nationalistic concerns. In fact, that same government report on salmon said that for the United States, canned salmon was one of its, quote, most useful mediums for opening new foreign markets to American goods and is performing missionary work in this respect, which cannot fail to benefit all branches of American foreign trade. A rather telling quote that helps us see that concerns for free trade have often meant buy our country's stuff and not this other country's stuff. But even with these nationalistic concerns, the canned salmon trade still represents the genius of the liberal system. The global salmon demand encouraged areas rich in salmon to seek a global market. The canned salmon provided nutritive sustenance for other areas better suited for coal mining, which needed fish because they had poisoned and overfished their own piscatory resources. But these salmon had to come from somewhere, and they were a finite resource. As Price explained, the salmon were the lifeblood of the Yupik communities he visited, but that life-giving source was threatened. Price saw the pressure that the salmon canneries were already putting on the fish supply for the Yupik, and he worried that unless something was changed, the Yupik would be utterly decimated and even possibly die out. So the salmon were like an ecological subsidy for the United Kingdom, allowing the British to foul up potential local sources of food through the industrial extraction of coal by tapping into global ecological capital, used to produce cheap tin substitutes in order to keep the British people going, albeit with a marked decline in physical robustness among the general English population, and at undeniable cost to the Yupik. It is actually quite surreal to read Orwell's observations about the general decline of English health and how closely they track with Price's studies. As Orwell explained, it is probable that the physical health has been declining all over England for a long time past. It is a conclusion that is forced upon you if you use your eyes, even in rural places, and even in a prosperous town like London. On the day when King George V's body passed through London on its way to Westminster, I happened to be caught for an hour or two in the crowd in Trafalgar Square. It was impossible, looking about one then, not to be struck by the physical degeneracy of modern England. The people surrounding me were not working-class people, for the most part. They were the shopkeeper commercial traveler type, with a sprinkling of the well-to-do. But what a set they looked. Puny limbs, sickly faces, under the weeping London sky, hardly a well-built man or a decent-looking woman, and not a fresh complexion anywhere. As the king's coffin went by, the men took off their hats, and a friend who was in the crowd on the other side of the Strand said to me afterwards, the only touch of color anywhere was the bald heads. While the salmon may have been helping keep everyone alive, and let's be honest, in comparison with the sugary tea, cheap chocolate, and the bread and margarine that the British working class also subsisted on, the salmon was definitely on the more sustaining end of their industrialized food staples. It was a paltry replacement for a robust local food culture, and the effects of this industrialized food were being seen not just among working class people, but among most everyone. Which now brings us to another important product that would not have been possible without the wonders of modernity. One of the best examples of what the liberal system can accomplish: chocolate. Orwell believed that cheap chocolate was part of the bread and circuses used to palliate the working classes. But the bread and circuses were not the brainchild of some nefarious elite trying to control the proletariat. Orwell found the ruling class far too incompetent and brain-dead to come up with such an ingenious plan. The cheap industrial substitutes, as Orwell argued, were the natural result of human taste becoming oriented towards the machine. But even if cheap chocolate wasn't the result of genius elite puppet masters, it wouldn't have been possible without the ingenious liberal system of trade and innovation. The miracle of the chocolate bar begins with the fruit of the cacao tree. Pods growing from the tree trunk and limbs contain seeds that become the cocoa beans that serve as the base for the tasty treat that so many of us adore. But the cacao tree is very particular when it comes to where it can grow, usually within 20 degrees north and south of the equator, the majority of trees growing within 10 degrees. And the cacao tree also requires certain conditions: stable temperatures, high humidity, ample rainfall, fertile soil, and shelter from the desiccating winds. The ideal climate is a rainforest. Given this limited range, it would be impossible for Europeans to grow cacao beans for any level of European consumption. Okay, maybe it was possible for this smallest scale of consumption, as evidenced by Rowntree's factory workers in 1932, who managed to coax a cacao plant along in a hothouse long enough to harvest one bean pod, which was used then to produce one very small chocolate bar, which was then presented to the Princess Elizabeth, with some claiming she is the only one who has ever eaten 100% British chocolate. But alas, most of us are not royalty, and in order for chocolate to be made for us common folk, we've needed some very favorable conditions, not just ecological conditions. The very conditions our ingenious liberal system provides to allow for the mass consumption of such a tasty treat. As British taste was oriented towards the machine, a series of industrial inventions helped make milk chocolate consumption for the masses possible. In Switzerland, two men's discoveries really got the ball rolling. A chemist, whose last name you might be familiar with, Henri Nestlé, devised a way to evaporate the moisture in milk to create powdered milk. Daniel Peter combined this powdered milk with cocoa powder, and by replacing the moisture with melted cocoa butter, they were able to pour the mixture into molds and have them harden into chocolate bars. Other inventions, like Rudolf Lindt's conching process, made the chocolate smoother and mellow, while Jean Tobler devised a tempering process that solved the problem of cacao butter crystallizing and becoming blotchy and discolored. So much of what we love about chocolate is rooted in these glory days of Swiss chocolate innovation, which were vital in bringing chocolate to the masses. But it wasn't these Swiss innovators alone that made Switzerland synonymous with chocolate. It was, as scholars Sophie and Michael D. Coe argue, Switzerland's cows. Milk was a cheaper ingredient that helped stretch the cacao and lower the price of a chocolate bar for your average consumer. But milk has its own intrinsic limitations. Even today, one of the most critical factors in determining where a large factory can produce milk chocolate is proximity to dairy cows, which has made the United States and Western Europe primely situated, given their moderate climates and ability to cultivate large amounts of hay and grain. If these constraints are a reality today, it was even more the case during the times of Price and Orwell, when chocolate factories were placed in the countryside where they could be closer to the milk supply, given milk's, if these constraints are a reality, sugar or cocoa. The importance of milk in chocolate production is borne out by Price's observations of the Swiss countryside in his travels. As Price traveled around Switzerland, he saw numerous large dairies, but was surprised to see so few cows as he passed through bucolic pastures. He was told dairies optimized milk production by keeping the cows in stables during the period of high production. The cows were apparently only let out to pasture after the fields had been harvested. By many economic indicators, the milk was put to good use, making the Swiss a major power in the production of milk chocolate and chocolate milk for domestic and international consumption. This seems like the perfect time to return to Christopher Lasch's critique of those who believed in capital P progress. Here we have the Swiss and consumers abroad seeking self-gratification that spurred on some of the most amazing production and innovation in chocolate we have ever seen. It's hard to argue with modernity when your mouth is full with a melting Swiss chocolate bar. But this progress in milk chocolate confectionery abilities was accompanied by undeniable costs. Let us return one more time to the Locke Valley in Switzerland. Price explained that in June, when the glacier milk grass was at its highest quality, the villagers would gather to express gratitude to God for the evidence of his being and the life-giving qualities of butter and cheese. This ceremony included the lighting of a wick in a bowl of the first butter and cheese made when the cows eat the grass near the snow line, right below the glaciers. Now, as these formerly remote villages, like Locke, were becoming incorporated into larger trade networks, that special milk, upon which so much of their robust health depended, was being traded away. To Price, it was a miserable exchange, trading invaluable, dare we say, holy, nourishing milk for cheap industrial substitutes, plus some extra spending money that would allow them to replace their homespun with machine-made clothing and various novelties that would soon be translated into necessities. This exactly illustrates one of the underappreciated stories of modernity. The world over, we have exchanged cultural, ecological, and physiological capital for cheap, flashy, and flimsy products. It's a lot harder to find God, let alone nutrient sustenance, in a slab of margarine. You might counter that liberalism has given birth to too many incredible innovations to argue with. Modern sanitation systems, vaccines, antibiotics, and modern medical discoveries, as well as trinkets and distracting novelties. That it was worth the trade-off for becoming mouth-breathing, slouching, orofacially compromised degenerates. And I could see where you're coming from. But even if you love liberalism, you have to recognize there is no free lunch. There are always trade-offs, even for miracles like the modern liberal system we all live in. Orwell noted man's ready acquiescence to the ease of the machine world, but he recognized that man, including Orwell himself, was becoming soft in this world, and Orwell wasn't quite comfortable with this development, declaring that ultimately he wanted a civilization in which progress is not definable as making the world safe for little fat men. But most of us, who get to experience the best of liberalism's convenience and plenty, seem okay with that. Modernity has yet to produce any food cultures as robust and protective as those that Price visited. The liberal system cannot replicate these communities, but it is ruthlessly effective at sucking out their physiological and cultural capital. Once these communities become incorporated into the industrial food system monoculture, the vast majority have no choice but to turn to modern dentistry, medicine, and pharmaceuticals as seemingly benevolent gods to deliver them from the ravages of liberalism, if they can afford it. I have spent this whole video arguing that the devastation of industrial food is one of the biggest weaknesses, if not the biggest, of modernity. But I'd like to conclude by emphasizing another argument I've been highlighting throughout the video as well. Perhaps we've struggled to see this weakness of modernity because industrial food is also one of the liberal imperial power's greatest weapons. As industrial foods spread abroad, they undermine other ways of life and tie the newly modernized people to the industrial food system and inevitably to the modern medical system required to treat its consequences. Under liberalism, man may be born free, but he comes into this world already chained to the industrial machine. Liberalism promised the full flourishing of human potential, as man was free to seek his own path. But a world where the individual is sovereign is a world that cannot produce robust food cultures and the protection they provide. What better way to undermine alternate ways of living than by supplanting the food, a foundational pillar of any local culture, with a deleterious, shelf-stable substitute? And this brings us back to Orwell, who, upon reflecting on the devastation wrought by the modern industrial technique, which provided cheap substitutes for everything, concluded, "We may find in the long run that tinned food is a deadlier weapon than the machine gun." Thank you.